The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Apologies in advance today for Lewis's audio problems. It's a work in progress. We have a piece of equipment we're waiting for, and Lewis may sound a little bit screechy today, for lack of a better term. Donald Trump has surged further ahead in the Republican field. There's a new CNN ORC poll. All of the shenanigans, all of the hijinks, all of the insanity, including in the most recent Republican debate, do not seem to be hurting Donald Trump. The new poll has Trump at 24% of support from Republican registered voters. The nearest competitor is former Florida Governor Jeb Bush at 11 points behind Trump. 13% is the second place Jeb Bush. Behind Bush is retired neurosurgeon Ben Carson at 9, Florida Senator Marco Rubio and Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker at 8, Kentucky's Rand Paul at 6, Texas Senator Cruz, former tech CEO Carly Fiorina, and Ohio Governor John Kasich all at 5, and Mike Huckabee, 10th out of 10, at 4%. Trump, the biggest gainer in this poll, up 6 points since July, according to the first nationwide CNN ORC poll since that debate on August 6th. Carson is up, Fiorina is up, but Trump doing really well, and also his favorability rating now higher, Lewis, up to 58%. That was only 50 a month ago. What do you think? Is Trump going to be the Republican nominee?
Well, right now, yes, I guess he would be, right? I guess speaking like a fourth grader and just saying inflammatory things is all you need to become the Republican nominee. Seems like this is what's going to happen, right? I mean, who is going to take over here?
I don't know who's going to take over, but I maintain that as soon as the substantive policy discussions begin, Trump is going to fall apart. Our next segment will give us an example of that. But remember that this last Republican debate had no policy debate. There was no policy discussed. Randomly, you would hear something sort of sounding like policy. As I jokingly said, Chris Christie made it clear that he'd be open to thinking about arguing whether to discuss policies he may have in a future debate. As soon as Donald Trump is really asked for specifics on policy, the implosion is going to happen. I hope that this happens as late as possible in the campaign. The longer Trump stays in, the more damage he does to the eventual Republican nominee. And hopefully, the longer Trump stays in, the more invigorated he will be to run as a third-party candidate, which would be terrific for whoever is the eventual Democratic nominee.
Yeah, I just can't remember the last time I watched a debate in which policy was actually discussed with nuance and exact details were discussed. It just doesn't happen in these debates. And so I don't think that is going to be a huge problem for Trump, because none of the candidates are going to be speaking to policy in that way.
All right, so let's give an example now of why, if and when the policy discussion starts for Republicans, it's going to be very, very bad for Donald Trump. This is the funniest Trump clip of the campaign so far, even funnier than when he went on a xenophobic tirade against Mexicans, who he assumes some are good people. During an interview on Meet the Press, Donald Trump admitted that he gets his military advice from watching TV. This is just the best, Lewis. Chuck Todd asked Donald Trump, well, who do you turn to? Who would you turn to for military advice? And here is Donald Trump's answer. Take a look.
We had a victory.
Who do you talk to for military advice right now?
Well, I watch the shows. I mean, I really see a lot of great, when you watch your show and all of the other shows, and you have the generals, and you have certain people that you like.
But is there somebody who's their go-to for you?
Probably there are two or
every
three.
presidential candidate has a go-to.
Probably there are 2 or 3. I mean, I like Bolton. I think he's tough cookie, knows what he's talking about. Jacobs is a good guy.
You mean Ambassador John Bolton?
Yes.
You mean Colonel Jack Jacobs?
Colonel Jack Jacobs is a good guy, and I see him on occasion.
I love this. This is just the best. And then he goes on to say, well, there were a couple. I mean, Bolton is a tough cookie. John Bolton, one of the heinous architects of the totally ridiculous war and occupation of Iraq. Let's put Trump's answer up on the screen and read it together. So the question again from Chuck Todd, military advice, right? Where would Donald Trump get military advice? And Donald Trump says, and I quote, well, I watch the shows. I mean, I really see a lot of great, when you watch your show and all of the other shows and you have the generals. This is not a joke. This is not a joke. And it is scary, not only because it shows us what we all know, which is Trump can't have a serious substantive policy discussion. But remember that back in 2002 and 2003, the shows, what was being said on the shows on corporate media seemed to be enough to get us into war with Iraq, right? The media pundits were responsible. The corporate news channels were responsible. The generals, as Donald Trump says, TV generals were responsible. And John Bolton in particular was one of the worst guys there. So terrible for Trump, embarrassing for Trump, but really scary too.
Well, it's sad because we get all of our presidential information from the shows. Maybe that's why Trump is doing so well, because all we do is watch the shows and watch TV, and that's where we get all of our information, and that's how we vote. At least, well, maybe not everyone, but the majority of Americans.
And with regard to Donald Trump, he's asked what is presumably, right? Let's give Chuck Todd the benefit of the doubt. Presumably a serious political question. Trump is pushed for some level of detail, right? Military advice. And he falls completely flat on his face, right? I watched the shows and there are some great shows and you have the generals, right? And the first debate did not bring this out because, as we talked about earlier, no real substantive policy discussion. And we are seeing that Trump really cannot have serious conversations about policy. This is just the first of what I hope, Lewis, will be many expositions of that.
Yeah, I would like to see these tough questions and very specific policy questions asked of Trump. I just don't think we'll see much of that during the debates.
It's super trendy right now to be against Planned Parenthood if you're a Republican, even though 97% of what Planned Parenthood does has nothing to do with abortion services. It's STD screening, STD prevention, contraception services, women's services of all kinds, etc. It's still really popular to talk about how bad Planned Parenthood is. Presidential candidate and former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum spoke at none other than an anti-Planned Parenthood rally in Iowa over the weekend. He equated legal abortion in America to the Holocaust and called it cancerous. He talked about a book he read, and the second that Santorum opened this statement by saying, "I recently read a book," my interest was piqued, Lewis. I was thrilled to hear what would come next, and it was as insane as any of us would have expected. Let's take a listen to Rick Santorum here.
I read a book recently by Andy Andrews. Some of you may have read it. It's a little tiny book. And the title of the book is How Do You Kill 11 Million People? He could have retitled it, How Do You Kill 55 Million People here in America? But his book was about the Holocaust. And you know what his answer was in one simple sentence? How do you kill 11 million people? You lied to them. You lied to them. Planned Parenthood, the abortion industry, Roe versus Wade, all of it is based on a lie about when a child becomes a human being. And we see the poisonous, wretched, cancerous result of that lie. Every lie, we all know, we tell our kids.
If Republicans only cared as much for people who were already born as they claim to care about the unborn, our entire country would be drastically different, because so much of what the progressive side of the political spectrum is trying to do on social policy is derailed or held up by the fact that the right is obsessed with talking about caring for the unborn with very little attention paid to those who have been born. If we could get people like Rick Santorum to care about those who have been born as much as they say they care about the unborn, we would have a drastically different status quo here in this country.
And I'm pretty sure the Bible says a whole lot more about taking care of people who are people and born and walking around than it does about the unborn. I'm not an expert, but I think that's the case.
This is an insult to every Holocaust victim, to every Holocaust survivor. Almost everyone has realize that this is not a good way to score political points, but still we hear politicians compare things to some combination of the Holocaust, the Nazis, Hitler, and or cancer. It is an insult to just about every clear-thinking and rational individual, in particular Holocaust victims and survivors. But this is popular, Lewis. This counts. The scariest part of all this is that this is considered reasonable debate on politics in the United States, demonizing an organization that is doing 97% STD screening, disease prevention, contraception, education, and the other 3%, a legal medical procedure which they cannot use federal funding for. Remember, they are not using federal funding for that 3% of abortion services. It's considered legitimate debate to trash that organization and what they do.
It is. It's, political discourse in this country is not ideal. It's kind of a joke, and I'm willing to bet that much of the world is laughing at us because of that.
You don't have to bet, Lewis, because we know from the polls that that's absolutely the case. So many countries at our level of development see what the debates are here, and they say, wait. It matters if someone is gay? Oh, wait a second. Abortion is controversial, and it's controversial because elected officials use the Bible to contradict that abortion should be legal? What's going on in the United States? That is what many countries are saying when they look at this laughingstock that has become the Republican Party on social issues. Let's take a break. What a program we have for you today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Our program depends on funding from you in our audience through the David Pakman Show membership program. davidpakman.com/membership is how you sign up. Today's new member of the day is Sean Davis. Sean, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. You can join Sean by going to davidpakman.com/membership. And of course, you can check out all of the great member benefits, including previews of some of those perks, including the world-famous bonus show at davidpakman.com/membership. Okay, so last week, a federal judge ordered Kentucky County Clerk Kim Davis to issue marriage licenses to couples regardless of gender. Of course, this includes couples that are two men or two women. She previously had refused a local same-sex couple, citing her religious beliefs. We told you about that story back when it took place. The couple is David Moore and David Ermold, who joined 4 other couples and sued. The next day, Moore and Ernold applied for a marriage license, and they were refused by a deputy in Davis's office. According to the Associated Press, quote, Deputy Clerk Nathan Davis says the office was advised by its attorneys with the Christian law firm Liberty Counsel to continue refusing same-sex couples as it appeals the ruling to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Davis in court claimed that if you sign a marriage license, you are essentially approving a marriage license, and thus the clerk could refuse to do so based on religious beliefs which do not approve of same-sex marriage. But U.S. District Judge David Bunning did not agree with that, saying in his 28-page ruling, Davis remains free to practice her apostolic Christian beliefs. She may continue to attend church twice a week, participate in Bible study, minister to female inmates at the Rowan County Jail. She is even free to believe that marriage is a union between one man and one woman, as many Americans do. However, her religious convictions cannot excuse her from performing the duties that she took an oath to perform as Rowan County Clerk. Let me simplify it for you. Believe whatever you want in your personal life. You work for the county. There are rules. There is a system of law, and your arbitrary religious beliefs do not supersede that law. It's very simple, Lewis.
It seems pretty simple. I think we have the right decision here, but this woman will probably be hailed as some type of religious hero, right? I mean, this is kind of like martyrdom.
In a sense, that is what they are trying to set themselves up to do. And the ACLU is considering whether there could be contempt of court charges for disobeying. This is a direct disobeyance of a court order. You have one job to do. Go to church, do all your stuff. But in your job, when two consenting adults want a marriage, marry them. Don't decide based on their gender. And we knew this was going to be the next front in the war against gay marriage. They lost at the Supreme Court. I still don't think that this strategy is going to work long term, though. The idea that, okay, fine, that may be the law, but we can opt out of portions of the law based on our arbitrary and self-professed religious beliefs. I do not believe this is going to work long term.
Yeah, probably not. I have a great idea. I think since this is legal nationwide now and bans are illegal, I think that everyone who is against this should just switch countries. I think you should just move to a country where this is not legal, and then you can have complete peace of mind that you are living in a place that, is in line with your religious beliefs. Does that sound okay?
Unfortunately, those countries are probably not the countries that these folks would want to live in.
Well, there might be a couple here and there. I know exactly what you're trying to say, but maybe we just crush them all, push them all into the Vatican. There might not be enough room. I don't know.
I don't know that the Vatican wants these folks, as I've said before. This is a brand of breaking down the separation of church and state that many who are religious in other parts of the world would see as totally inappropriate. It's quite our own brand that has been created here in the United States. The Intercept has published a really big expose on the new case in the United States against DuPont for their Teflon products. Interestingly enough, our friend Mike Papantonio, attorney and host of Ring of Fire, is lead counsel on this case. And this is a big case for Pap. It is, there's this whole backstory to this Teflon case where an attorney working on the case stumbled across a document that mentioned this compound called PFOA, and started looking into this. PFOA is a compound known within the chemical industry as a surfactant because it reduces the surface tension of water. And it's slippery, it's chemically stable. It's a critical ingredient in many products, including Teflon. And slowly but surely, as these attorneys often are able to discover, the documents pointed to knowledge from DuPont that this product and Teflon may be harmful to health. And I encourage you to read the entire Intercept piece, which has stories of individuals and so many other stories. We're going to be following Pap's case against DuPont. What do you think, Lewis? I know you've heard of this Teflon controversy. It's not always easy, number one, to tell if you have a Teflon pan. Sometimes you can tell, sometimes you can't. There are many products likely harming us, and we just don't yet know. And of course, there's the convenience factor, Lewis, right? I mean, there are alternatives to have a non-stick pan that is not a Teflon pan, but here we have convenience versus possible health effects, and we will see what happens with this case. Where are you on Teflon?
Well, I avoid it at all costs, and without having known about all of this stuff a while ago when I was working in the restaurant industry, there would be these nonstick pans that would be covered in scratches because cooks might be using harsh metal utensils on them. And so I could smell the chemicals coming off of this stuff. It would seep into the food. And I'm thinking to myself, you don't smell this, you don't realize this, and it smells horrible. And I just thought that, best to avoid this stuff. I use stainless steel pots and pans. They work perfectly fine. I clean them and there's no crap on them. And that works.
All right. So talk to me about this, Lewis, because I was researching. I still have some Teflon pans, and I think I'm going to get rid of them at this point. Specifically, when I move to Boston, will be a really good opportunity to get rid of them. Cast iron is considered like this is the safest thing, cast iron, but it is tougher to get non-stick to happen with cast iron. And there are different strategies for doing it, including keeping a sort of coat of oil on the cast iron skillet all the time and using the right cooking temperature, etc. But it is kind of tough to get cast iron to be non-stick sort of casually in the way that Teflon is non-stick.
But there are people use cast iron differently. Certainly in some situations, cast iron is ideal, and you might want to have a skillet around depending on what you're cooking. But stainless steel just seems to be perfectly safe, and it's very easy. It's not as heavy as the cast iron, and it works well for me.
There it is. So stainless steel, better for the non-stick component than cast iron, and a completely different situation than Teflon as far as chemicals. There's another coating called Thermalon, which is supposedly safe, right? It's a safe version of Teflon, but to be honest, I have not looked into whether it is indeed safe or not. Safest for sure is cast iron. Stainless steel appears to be a sort of good option that seems safe and is more non-stick than cast iron. Send me your thoughts on this. We will be following this case, and we will report the outcome, and if any wrongdoing is accepted. You know, often in these cases, you get a settlement, Lewis, from the company where one of the provisions is we will pay out victims, plaintiffs, but we do not want to admit wrongdoing. And that can often be more confusing because 5 years down the line, people will research Teflon and they'll say, oh, wait, there was never wrongdoing admitted in this case, so I'm not worried about it. And that can often be deceptive.
Yeah, but that this is making headlines, I think, is a good thing. So we can be thankful for that. And, everyone just avoid the Teflon pots and pans.
Last week, I had a clip for you of televangelist Jim Bakker selling prepper food, right? These bulk food containers with the warning that cannibalism may be coming to America. So the solution is obviously to buy prepper food from him. It was like 300 gallons of corn soup or corn chowder. Who even knows what it was? There's another piece that is even more insane from the Jim Bakker show, where he is in this interview he did with fellow End Times preacher Rick Wiles, where he announced that it makes sense to buy horses in case there is a nuclear EMP attack that takes down the power grid. So EMP is an electromagnetic pulse. The idea is that you can use an electromagnetic pulse as a sort of weapon to knock out all electronics and communications. And I'm going to play the clip for you here. I'm warning you, if you have a negative physical reaction to televangelistic BS, then you may want to take some Pepto-Bismol or maybe pause and prepare yourself before you watch this, because buying horses as a result of a possible EMP is insanity. Let's listen to Jim Bakker.
This week, we're in the process of buying horses. I'll tell you, if the grid goes down, you're going to be thankful to have a horse. So if you got a farm, keep the farm, keep the horses.
And I'll tell you what.
My dad literally rode from Michigan to the West Coast when he was a boy with the horses drawing the buggies and the carriages and all the farm stuff. And I'm telling you, the horses will move. And we got a Model T. See my Model T back there? I brought it up from the valley. That will run. It runs. It runs right now. That will run if the grid goes down.
And if there's an EMP.
Right.
EMP. That's right. The EMP bomb.
That's right.
That will run.
That's
but
right.
So,
you know,
or even
that
major
was,
solar flares.
The solar flares, which EMP, which
well,
I just
that's in the
to
news
see,
right now.
I
Yes,
just
it
happened
is.
to see it yesterday. I called Sasha. I said, make sure you guys record this. Once again, there was Shepard Smith on Fox
Do you have
News.
that? Do you have
I
that?
We
said,
do.
can you believe what this guy, God is using this?
After he was done, Lewis, explaining the threats of an EMP attack and solar flares, he said God is preparing to punish America for its insane, as he described it, abortion rights and same-sex marriage policies. Hey, at least the EMP, the electromagnetic pulse, would shut down these Christian TV stations that take advantage of people by trying to sell them bulk food and horses.
Yeah, I've been praying for a large-scale EMP attack. Wouldn't a bicycle work just as well? I mean, I think they forgot to mention bicycles. There are probably many bike companies out there that would love to have televangelists, trying to sell their products. And, well, I guess the commission on a bicycle isn't nearly as good as the commission on a horse, right?
Yeah, why do you need a horse, right? I mean, even if you say not a bicycle, but if you have a sort of basic motorcycle or dirt bike, why would that be impacted by an EMP?
It would not. It would not. Maybe they just like horses because, I don't know, they're big, beautiful, majestic creatures. And they are much greener than a motorbike, I would say.
A fear of what, Lewis, would cause you to buy a horse? I'm guessing the possibility of an EMP is not that, but what would make you afraid enough of something to go out and start buying horses?
I can't think of anything. I can't think of anything. Maybe starvation. Not that I endorse eating horses or want to eat a horse, but if horses were my only option, maybe I would have to eat horse meat. But I can't envision any scenario in which I would go out and buy a horse.
Thank you very much, Lewis. I'm glad Lewis clarified that for us. I'll remind you, we are working on Lewis's audio. We've ordered a part that we think will resolve it, and that will hopefully be in time for tomorrow's show. In the meantime, I appreciate you dealing with the sort of strange noises coming from Lewis's microphone. We'll take a break. We will speak to Dr. Cathleen Lewis after the break.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to The David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Dr. Cathleen Lewis, who's the curator for the International Space Programs and the Spacesuit Collection at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. I've always found it so interesting, Dr. Lewis, this whole process of how someone who curates a museum, particularly a Smithsonian museum, decides what is of value to have here. With this particular item that you're now working on, which is Neil Armstrong's spacesuit, you've actually got a Kickstarter campaign going, which we'll talk about. As a general thing, how do you decide what's worth having in a museum?
We usually decide what's worth having is how well an object defines an event or a person or a mission, something in history. So obviously Neil Armstrong's suit is connected to the moon landing and that particular event. There are also other suits in the collection that define the process in which the spacesuit designers went about in coming up with the design of the spacesuit. We have objects that are related to events that never happened for that field in the history of technology of fiddling and finagling with objects to make them better. Sometimes they're dead ends. So we're looking for objects that tell a story.
And when you started working on this project to preserve Neil Armstrong's spacesuit, this Kickstarter campaign was created. The goal was $500,000. With about 16 hours to go, you're well past that, almost $200,000 beyond that. For people who might hear that number and say, why does it cost $500,000 to preserve Neil Armstrong's spacesuit? What are the costs and processes involved?
Well, the costs are actually fairly modest when you look at it as you break them down. They're for travel and research, of course, but we're also going to be purchasing a case for his suit that will have its own climate control system that will keep it at a relatively moderate temperature, about 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and a low relative humidity. The case will have an air circulation system, an air handling system that will take out the molecules that are the products of the degradation of the plastics in the suits. So it'll keep it at a fresh climate that will actually postpone and hold off the deterioration of the suit. We're also going to be doing a 3D scan of the suit. The scanning itself we do in-house, but it's the processing and making that scan into something meaningful, both for our own research, but also for the public. So they'll be able to have access to that both inside the museum as part of their visit in the museum on their own electronic devices, or from home on electronic devices, so they can visit Neil Armstrong's spacesuit from the comfort of their own home.
And you, for people who are interested in seeing more about the spacesuit Kickstarter, you can Google Neil Armstrong spacesuit Kickstarter, and it's the first thing that comes up. You really can't miss it. Let's talk a little bit about some of your other work. I was interested to read that in your background is not only bachelor's and master's degrees in Russian and East European studies at Yale, but your dissertation also focused on USSR spaceflight. And I'd be curious to hear from you, is there anything that you can sort of point to that very specifically is different about the USSR sort of perspective on space exploration relative to the US?
Well, it's very interesting in comparing the two sides. Obviously, both sides were dealing with the same physics. Sending objects and humans into space requires the same lift capability, the sealing the capsule, providing a spacesuit first for backup and then for actually working, doing meaningful work in space. There are great differences in style and approach. And the ways that both sides do things. The Russians tend to stick with things that work. They do small incremental refinements in their program. If you look for the example of spacesuits, if you look at the difference in spacesuits, there's a great continuity between the spacesuit that Yuri Gagarin wore over 50 years ago in space and the spacesuits that Russians still use today for launch and entry inside the Soyuz launch vehicle, the Soyuz capsule. They're very consistent in what they do. On the other hand, in contrast, on the American side, we go from program to program, and the spacesuits have to match the spacecraft, and the spacecraft, which has a different function, a different goal, is designed by a new contractor in a wholly different way.
Is there a particular reason sort of inherent to Soviet culture that got the USSR so fascinated and involved in the space race? Or do you think it was more a circumstance where they had the money and the sort of resources and that was a primary driver?
Well, if you go back to the 1920s and 30s, that interwar period when aviation was taking off, you can see that throughout the world, and this is especially the case in the United States, Europe, and Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, all sides had this fascination with spaceflight. And it was only during this early period of aviation that it was beginning to come into the realm of a possibility. And you have rocket societies that grew up in the 20s and 30s. And remarkably, even with the closed society that was the Soviet Union, during that period, they were able to communicate with the West. And you have individuals, Perelman and also Willy Ley in Germany, who were able to communicate their ideas and aspirations. And until that was closed down towards the mid-1930s, when both in the Soviet Union and in Germany, they co-opted those civilian rocket societies into military operations, you had a lot of communications and shared ideas about going into space. So this is something that has existed for a long time, largely inspired by Jules Verne in the 19th century and his writings about traveling to the moon. So all sides had this interest, and fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you evaluate it, it was only the product of the B-2 rocket that allowed those ideas to come to fruition after World War II.
I have what may be a sort of irrationally utopian idea that for all of the ways in which countries are divided and fighting each other, that when it comes to space exploration and the idea that there's just sort of something bigger than any of the divisions among humans on Earth, that it can really be a sort of uniting force. And then some of my friends tell me that I'm completely wrong, that as soon as there are resources to be claimed or other factors at play with regard to space exploration, the sort of cooperation that we're seeing among countries that don't often get along so well is going to disappear. Do you have a sense one way or the other of that?
Well, the bottom line is the bottom line for exploration, especially human exploration. It's enormously expensive. If you send a human into space, to the moon, to Mars, you have to provide food, water, oxygen for that person, and it becomes enormously expensive as the distance and the time goes on. I think that as in the United States, Russia, European Space Agency, Canada, and Japan have come to the conclusion that it is too expensive to do on their own. It's beyond the scope of any national budget. Even countries that are doing independent programs, such as China, their plans are very limited in scope. So I think the ideal of going out there and exploring our solar system even will have to be a multinational effort, just because the resources are not there to fund that sort of program.
All right, so ideally my utopian view is not too irrational or disconnected.
I sincerely hope so. I think that we would discover more by working together than fracturing it out and going out for goals for mining and all sorts of potentials. And even those are very expensive operations at this point, and far beyond the means of any corporation or country.
Let me remind everybody to check out the Kickstarter to preserve Neil Armstrong's spacesuit. Just Google Neil Armstrong spacesuit Kickstarter, and it'll be the first thing that comes up. About 16 hours remaining there. And I'll remind you, we've been speaking with Dr. Cathleen Lewis, who's the curator for international space programs and the spacesuit collection at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. One of my, I have to say, my favorite museum when I go to Washington, D.C.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for being on with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Uzbekistan Airlines have announced a new policy that involves weighing all passengers shortly before takeoff. They put out a statement which says they made this decision to install a special weighing machine at departure gates where passengers would be weighed with their luggage, saying, quote, according to the rules of International Air Transport Association, airlines are obliged to carry out the regular procedures of pre-flight control passengers weighing with hand baggage to observe requirements for ensuring flight safety. I know that the grammar of that statement does not make perfect sense, but the idea here is that this is a safety issue. So the way it would work is after you pass check-in and you go to the boarding area, you would go through the special weighing machine along with your luggage. And the idea is that they would be able to ensure that the plane is properly distributing weight and not overweight, etc. And they guarantee, Lewis, full confidentiality of the results. Now, a spokesperson for the agency, International Air Transport Association, denied having any awareness of the regulation cited by Uzbekistan Airlines here, which would require passengers to stand on a scale, restating what we all knew if we had looked into this at all, which is that airlines calculate the passenger loads as a sort of mathematical average. They say we have 50 men and 40 women and 30 kids. Here's an average weight. Here's the total weight that we estimate, and that's much closer, that's close enough, so to speak. Now, since news broke of this, Uzbekistan Airlines did not return requests for comment, and the pre-flight procedures page, which mentioned this weighing machine, some call it a scale, had been taken down altogether from their website. So we don't know ultimately what is going to happen. Now, remember, Lewis, back in 2013, I think it was on the bonus show, you brought us the story of Samoa Airlines, which began pricing passenger tickets based on their weight. There is no overstating the importance of weight management on planes. It's important for countless reasons. It is a huge flight safety issue. However, there is not real evidence that properly using the average system, saying, okay, we'll use average weights based on men, women, and children. There's no evidence that properly using that system has ever caused a problem. Now, there are crashes in planes that have been overweight that have happened, including, I believe, one with the member of the band TLC. Or no, I'm wrong about that. Maybe it was Aaliyah, the singer Aaliyah. In any case, I apologize for forgetting, but a crash because of an overloaded plane. But that wasn't because the system was faulty, right? It wasn't because they used an average instead of an actual weight. It was because the system that was in place was just not used properly. On small planes, however, on very small planes, every passenger is asked their weight, period. So question one is it offensive to say that we are going to have a policy of weighing every passenger in the interest of just being more precise with regard to weight management? I don't think there's anything wrong in principle with that.
No, I don't see a problem here. It's a safety precaution, and I might even feel good that this is happening on their airlines. Just making absolutely sure. So it's fine, whatever. It's their prerogative. They are allowed.
Certainly, I have no problem with it in principle. However, what I would question would be, number one, incorrectly stating that this is a result of a policy that a broader organization has put in place that doesn't appear to be true, and number two, we just have to make sure that whatever method you're actually using properly, right? That's really the main concern. I don't find any problem at all if you want to travel on an airline that has this policy, and you don't like that policy, then you have to make the decision. Are you willing to be weighed, or are you just not willing to travel on that airline? There is sort of no inherent right to dictate the policies of airlines, presuming that they don't violate law. And I am okay with airlines doing this if that is what they are determining they want to do. Let's just all be upfront about whether this is mandated or not.
Agreed. Yeah, I think they knew there'd be some outrage about this. Perhaps they didn't handle it as well as they should have. But you know what? I'm still fine with this protocol here.
California will no longer use grand juries in cases involving police shootings of civilians after Governor Jerry Brown, a Democrat, signed a bill banning the secret deliberations. SB 227, which was authored by State Senator Holly Mitchell, makes California the first state in the United States to ban the use of grand juries to decide whether law enforcement should face criminal charges in use of force cases. And we've previously discussed that grand juries are far less likely to indict police shooters than civilian shooters. And we could hypothesize as to why that is. One option would be, well, the cases brought to grand juries involving police use of force are weaker cases and thus are more often correctly not followed with an indictment. But that's a very sort of pulled from the sky hypothesis, because there's no actual evidence whatsoever to support that. More likely is another combination of factors, which would be grand juries made up of people that are usually too protective of police image is a factor, combined with a sort of deference to police officers that's not prescribed by the law with regard to these shootings. And all of those factors together can sort of create more of a benefit of the doubt for grand juries with regard to police actions. And I think that this is going to be a very interesting decision, Lewis, to track whether it changes the percentage of these cases involving police use of force that are ultimately followed by an indictment. Will it change, or will it remain the same after we eliminate the use of a grand jury?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting move. I would still like to see, independent prosecutors here. Bring in the prosecutors from somewhere else. I think that is probably the best thing you can do in cases like this. But of course, to decide if those charges should be there, I think this makes sense and is an interesting experiment.
I agree with you, because it's not an obvious win to say no more grand juries, because prosecutors work with police all the time. There can still be a conflict of interest there, but you can at least peel back sort of one layer of the problem. Layer two would be, even if you bring in different prosecutors from a different geographical area, those prosecutors still work with police regularly, just the police in their area, and you may still have this sort of extrajudicial deference to police that may not be indicated by the law. This is a very interesting way forward. The data suggested that something needed to be done with regard to grand juries and police shootings. California has done something, and now we will ultimately see whether there's a change in the indictment percentage. Would you predict, Lewis, that we would see a higher rate of indictment on police use of force cases once we remove grand juries, or would you not be surprised to see it unchanged?
I think, if anything, you will see a higher rate of indictment here. That's my guess.
We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Call us anytime. Here's one voicemail we received.
Yeah, my name is Derek. I think there's a double standard, because they expect black people to explain Chicago's violence. Doesn't matter if a black person's been in Chicago ever, but they expect black people to explain Chicago's violence. So it's like Jews explaining Israeli violence. It's just as irrational.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is in reference to yesterday's story about reggae artist Matisyahu being basically canceled or banned from a Spanish music festival after he was told, you need to make a video or written statement endorsing a Palestinian state. Of course, Matisyahu, not Israeli, he's just an American Jew. And it is that same sort of double standard where we see it when it comes to Muslims denouncing Islamic violence. We're seeing it in this case with Matisyahu. We've seen it with African Americans and denouncing violence in Chicago, African Americans that may have no connection whatsoever to Chicago. And I appreciate the analogy in the voicemail. On today's bonus show, bulls kill 7 people in Spain, a book that gives you clean drinking water, and Oxford gets caught plagiarizing Wikipedia. All of these stories and more on the bonus show. Go to davidpakman.com/membership to sign up today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.